YouTube. Tonight we're going to show you how to pull the oil pan off of a 2005 5.9 liter Cummins turbo diesel. A couple things I want to go over with you guys. There's quite a few videos out there on YouTube on how to do this without having to pull the transmission and go really far into detail on how to do it. I'm a firm believer in kissing it, keeping it simple, stupid. So after watching a couple of videos out there on how some guys did it, I give all the props to you guys on figuring out the best way. After looking at the videos and just assessing the truck and looking it over, I think there's a couple of things we could probably do a little bit better, and I can show that to you. Some guys aren't going to have the option to use a block and tackle from the beams from the ceiling. You got to use an engine pick. That happens, but in this case we're not going to do that, just in the sole sake of an engine pick is going to, a cherry picker is going to have the legs in your way as you're working under the vehicle. So in this case we have the front hook right up top here. I'm going to show you about that in a little bit. But we're not going to pull the engine out. We're not going to drop the transmission down. What we're going to do is we're going to drop the transmission cross member bolts, just so that way when we're picking the engine up, we need to get about 6 inches of clearance. We're gonna raise the engine up 6 inches, and we're also gonna do that with the transmission coming up at the same level, so we're not raising the engine and then tweaking that back transmission mount. You know, that'll screw up the rubber on that, and that's one thing I did notice that some guys didn't do. I think it's a pretty fairly simple thing to do. Just drop that nut out on the cross member, and that way the transmission will raise and lower with the engine. It's a pretty simple job, it looks like. We're gonna take the oil dipstick tube bolt off. That's a 10 millimeter. It looks like everything on this truck is going to be a metric so far. So we're going to take the oil dipstick tube bolt off. That way we're not bending the oil dipstick tube. We're going to slide that right out. We have the intake manifold that's coming up into the right hand side of the motor if you're facing it, the engine. We are just going to drop the rubber boot right off. That's a I'll tell you right now, that's an 11 millimeter, so you're going to zip that off with an 11 millimeter. And then the next up on your list you're going to want to take off is the engine shroud nuts. There are 4 of them, 2 up top, 2 on the bottom. It's a 13 millimeter. And then next you're going to want to go over to the down over here where you have the turbo coming up from the up pipe. There you have 3 clamps. You're going to want to take off the clamp in the middle. If you take off the clamp towards the end of the truck, the tailpipe side, you're going to have that 90 or that 45 that's on there, and that might get bound up when you're raising the engine up. So I'm pretty confident that dropping the middle one out is going to be the most effective and time-saving one to drop out. So we have the intake manifold, we have the shroud nuts that we have to drop out. We have we got it hooked up there, and we have the up pipe clamp that we got to drop out. That's basically it. Looks like everything for the top of the engine. Once we go underneath it, I'll show you where the cross member nut is going to be. You're going to want to drop them off, and then should just really raise up the engine and take the nuts out on the oil pan. Hey there, guys, give you a little update here on the 2005 5.9 liter Cummins oil pan removal. Just wanted to give you guys a couple of updates and make some corrections in some of the direction I gave you. What I found was the bolts that hold the fan shroud on, the nuts that hold the fan shroud on, I don't find that it's necessary. You have to take those off. So I just wanted to correct that. It's not that big of a deal. They'll go back on in 2 minutes, but it's 2 minutes I can save you that you don't have to do that task. But overall, we started this last night at 8:30 p.m. and we had the oil pan off in about an hour and 45 minutes to 2 hours later, and that's with you know, not really rushing through it. So that just shows you if you follow these steps, it's pretty cut and dry. I also saw on some YouTube videos that some people had to use bottle jacks on the driver's side of the engine in order to raise that side of the engine up when they were raising it up, because if you don't, the engine kind of falls to the side. If you utilize the back engine hook of the back of the driver's side with the top front passenger side hook, and you rig it this way, even if you're using a cherry picker, we didn't have to use a bottle jack. And even if you do use that bottle jack trick, you're really risking having the engine slip off and crush your hand and get stuck under the truck. It's really not the right way to do it. So I really don't recommend that. But if you have to, you got to do what you got to do sometimes. So as you see, we have it rigged up with a block and tackle, and we just pulled it right up. We loosened up the 2 engine mounts, and we left the bolts in place. We just loosened the nuts, and that came right up. We just loosened up the boot for the intake manifold, coming at where it goes for the up pipe, and we didn't have to actually disconnect anything. We just undid the oil dipstick tube here. We left that in place, and then down on the inside of the engine, on the passenger side, you have your turbo, goes to the 45, going to the up, the down pipe for your exhaust. This truck has a 5-inch stainless exhaust on it. We had to just loosen up the middle flange clamp. We just loosened it up, and when we raised the engine up, it really didn't even move that much. So I still recommend doing it just to get yourself that little extra play. But you know, if you're PB blasting these things up, you know, a couple days in advance, it comes right undone. All right, guys, we're under the truck here. We're looking at the transmission tail shaft, tail housing. I mentioned earlier that I highly recommend loosening up taking the bolts out. There was one that was here, and there's one on the opposite side. Because when you're raising up the engine, if you don't undo that, you're really putting a lot of pressure on this rubber mount, and you're going to tweak it. So I don't recommend doing that. And as you can see, we have about an inch of it's raised up about an inch. So if we didn't undo that, we would have been pulling up on this whole cross member and probably ruining this. You probably put a lot of stress, and you'll probably wind up ruining this mount. So just, you know, take these two bolts out, and as you'll see, that'll raise up in uniform with the engine as it goes up in the air. So a little bit of a tip there. If you don't do it, it'll still work, but I don't recommend it. And we'll head on over to where we took the oil pan out, and you'll see an oil pan that's not there anymore. You'll see this cross member up in here. We have a lot of room in there now. One good note to show is you have your pickup tube for the oil sump. You don't really have a lot of room to play with once you get the engine up in the air as far as it can go. When the oil pan is at the back of the bell housing here, it comes down, and you literally have, like, I don't know, an 1/8 inch of play before to get this out. So you just got to be careful that you don't bend this or mess it up. It really wasn't difficult. Once we had the engine as high as it can go, it really just kind of slid right out. So what we're going to do today is we picked this job back up here in the morning, and we have the gasket that's still stuck to the face of the bottom of the engine. So we're going to clean that up with brake clean. We're going to pack this crank cavity here with rags so we don't get any of the salt and debris that's on the truck. It is a nasty winter here in New Jersey, and we even cleaned the bottom of the truck off pretty good, and just on the trip over here it got all crapped up. So you don't want to get any sort of particles, sand, grit, anything inside of here naturally, because that's just not going to be good for your engine. YouTubers, we're all said and done here with the 2005 5.9 liter Cummins turbo diesel oil pan replacement. Couple things I wanted to just recap with you on. The shroud bolts, there's 4 of them. I had said earlier that you needed to remove them. I wasn't sure, so you don't need to do that. So leave them in place. Overall, pretty straightforward job. You might have a little difficulty, as I recommended replacing or taking out the bolts for the transmission tail shaft cross member. I definitely recommend doing that, just because you saw in the video that we had about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of clearance there. So that was about 1.5 inches of stress that you would have been putting on your the rubber mount underneath there. So lining that back up, you're going to want to put a floor jack underneath it and just raise it up a little bit, and then you have a little bit of play to line your bolt holes back up. But overall, it was a pretty straightforward job. Number one thing you want to remember is when you're underneath there and you have your old oil pan out, you're going to want to make sure that the face of the where the oil pan goes up to the bottom of the crank, bottom to the bottom end of the motor. You're going to want to make sure that it's nice and clean, free of any sort of old gasket material, rust, oil. So you're going to want to get yourself a couple of cans of brake clean and a little bit of WD-40 and a Scotch-Brite pad, and just spray some WD-40 along that face and just Scotch-Brite it. It gives a little bit of lubricant on there, and it helps clean it. And then just keep cleaning it off. I'd follow up with an just a little bit of air across the top of it to dry it all off good. Make sure you're good. No oil residue. You're going to want to use either a whole roll of paper towels or just some shop red rags. Just make sure you're nice and clean. The oil pan that we bought for this truck, it came off of Amazon. It came with the RTV eBay. Came off eBay, sorry. It came with the gray high temp RTV silicone with the gasket. So it was about $180 something all combined with the bolts. Believe it or not, the bolts, we put brand new bolts in with this. The bolts were like $109. I highly recommend not reusing the bolts just because the old ones are gonna have rust and debris on them. But if you have the time and patience and you got a whiz wheel on a grinder, you can definitely clean them up and reuse them. But I wouldn't recommend it. But overall, yeah, $109 for new bolts. The process you're gonna want to go through when you're assembling the new pan, so to speak. Take it out of the box. Make sure that it's nice and straight, level. There's no kinks, dings in the face of the oil pan where the bolt face goes. You're going to want to take your RTV silicone and wear a rubber glove and just put a skim coat along the top of that. Set your gasket, make sure it's nice and straight, and then put another skim coat across the top of that. Then go into the truck, and now you got a nice and clean bottom end. You're going to want to put a skim coat across the top of that. Build it up a little bit in the corners. It helps when you're compressing it. And then you're just going to want to go around the world a couple of times. You're going to want to tighten all the bolts up snug, and then go around it again. The one I recommend on eBay, the oil pan that we purchased, is a little bit different than the OEM oil pan. It has extra steel where the bolts tighten up against it. It's flatten up against. It helps it so you're not sandwiching the pan, and you know when you're tight. There is torque specs for it. We didn't do that. We just went tight. There's no leaks. It's good. But overall, that's pretty much it in a nutshell. The one thing I did not add in the beginning was we removed the hood. It's four bolts and a wiring harness just for the light. I highly recommend doing that. It gets it out of your way. It lets the light come on. When you're going to be putting the new oil pan, slipping it back in place, that you make sure that the bell housing is nice and clean on the transmission. There's no salt, debris, anything that can fall down inside the pan or on the gasket as you have it nice and clean and set. So that way when you're crunching it back up in there, it doesn't leave a void and you're not going to create a potential leak. So overall though, it was a pretty straightforward job. The transmission mount brackets, they were a 15 millimeter. The engine mounts were an 18 millimeter. Basically, just get your set of 18 millimeter open end box wrenches and some impact sockets, metric as well. But that's about it. I will say I am interested in helping anybody out. If you want to shoot me a PM or a message at the bottom of this link, I'm more than happy to give you some advice or anything like that. But I am not interested in all of you master diesel technicians of the world out there that probably have never even turned a wrench before, of critiquing my job here. This information is to help you guys, and that's the whole intent of the video. So if you have some pointers that you want to put into the messages, by all means, please do that. But again, please leave your nasty, stupid comments to yourself for those of you that are still sitting at home on your mom's couch, eating Cheetos and playing Xbox all day long. Catch you later.